I never believed in ghosts until I worked the night shift at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. This isn't some made-up campfire story. This happened to me in 2019 when I was doing security work in Louisville, Kentucky, trying to pay my way through college. Waverly Hills used to be a tuberculosis hospital back in the early 1900s. They say over 63,000 people died there before they finally shut it down in 1961. The place had been abandoned for decades until some paranormal investigation company bought it and started doing tours. My job was simple: make sure nobody broke in after hours, walk the rounds every 2 hours, and try not to think about all the death that had soaked into those walls. The first few nights were quiet. Sure, the building was creepy as hell. Long, dark hallways stretching into nothing. Rooms with rusted medical equipment still sitting there like the doctors had just stepped out for lunch 50 years ago. But it was just an old building, right? I told myself the weird sounds were just the place settling. Pipes creaking, wind through broken windows. Then came the night I met Mary. It was around 2 a.m., middle of October. I was doing my usual rounds on the 4th floor when I heard it. A woman crying. Not loud, just soft sobbing echoing down the hallway. I figured maybe someone had snuck in. Maybe some teenager trying to impress their friends or something. I followed the sound to room 502, the room they said had the most activity. The door was slightly open, which was weird because I always made sure all the doors were closed during my first round. I pushed it open and called out, "Hello, you're not supposed to be in here." The crying stopped immediately. I stepped into the room and shined my flashlight around. Empty, just an old metal bed frame and some graffiti on the walls from previous visitors. But the temperature in that room was at least 20 degrees colder than the hallway, and I swear I could smell something. Not the usual musty smell of the building, but something sweet and sickly, like flowers left too long in water. That's when I saw her reflection in the broken mirror on the far wall. A young woman in a white nightgown, standing right behind me. Dark hair hanging loose around her face, pale skin, and eyes that looked so tired, so incredibly sad. I spun around, nothing there. Looked back at the mirror. She was gone. I got the hell out of that room and radioed my supervisor. Told him I thought someone might be in the building. He laughed it off, said it was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me, but he agreed to come check it out. By the time Dave arrived an hour later, I'd almost convinced myself he was right. We walked through the whole building together, checked every room, every hiding spot. Nothing. Dave was a good guy, been doing security work for 15 years, and he could see I was genuinely spooked. "Look, Marcus," he said as we sat in the security office afterward, "I'm gonna level with you. This place gets to everybody eventually. I've been working here for 3 years, and I've seen some stuff I can't explain. But here's the thing, they're not trying to hurt you. Most of them are just stuck, I guess." "Them?" I asked. He nodded. "You'll see, but the woman in 502, that's Mary Hillenberg. She died there in 1928, only 19 years old. Lost her whole family to TB. Came here hoping to get better, but..." He shrugged. "Sometimes people see her when they're having a rough time. She's trying to comfort them, I think." I wanted to quit right then, but I needed the money, and honestly, something about what Dave said made me feel bad for her. Mary, if she was real, if she was really stuck there, that was just heartbreaking. The next week was quiet. I'd nod toward room 502 when I walked by, sometimes whisper, "Evening Mary," under my breath. Felt stupid doing it, but also felt like the right thing to do. Then my girlfriend Jessica broke up with me. Out of nowhere, just called and said she couldn't do the long distance thing anymore, that she'd met someone else at her college. I was devastated. I'd been planning to propose when I graduated. That night at work, I was a mess. Couldn't concentrate, kept thinking about all the plans we'd made. I was sitting in the security office around midnight, looking at pictures of Jessica on my phone, when I heard footsteps in the hallway above me. Slow, Deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs. The footsteps stopped as soon as I reached the 4th floor, but room 502's door was wide open, and there was a soft light coming from inside. Not electric light, more like moonlight, even though it was a cloudy night. I walked to the doorway and stopped. Mary was sitting on the old bed frame, looking right at me. Not a reflection this time, not a glimpse from the corner of my eye. She was just there, as real as anyone. She was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. Couldn't have been much older than me when she died. Her nightgown looked clean and white, like she'd just put it on. But her eyes held so much sadness, it made my chest hurt. "You're crying," she said. Her voice was soft, with just a hint of an old Kentucky accent. I reached up and touched my face. She was right. I hadn't even realized I was crying. "She left me," I said, and I don't know why I said it. Maybe because Mary looked like she understood sadness better than anyone. Mary nodded slowly. "I know about leaving, about being left behind." We sat there for a while. Me in the doorway, her on the bed. She didn't say anything else, but somehow her presence was comforting. Like Dave had said, she wasn't trying to scare me. She was just keeping me company while I hurt. Eventually, she started to fade. Not dramatically, just gradually becoming more transparent until she was gone. The strange light faded too, leaving just my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I worked at Waverly Hills for another 6 months after that. Saw Mary a few more times, always when I was having a particularly bad day. She never said much, just sat with me for a while. Other security guards had told me about their own experiences. The shadow people on the 3rd floor, the little girl who played in the children's ward, voices calling their names from empty rooms. The building was full of the dead, but they weren't monsters. They were just people who had died scared and alone, and somehow couldn't move on. The real horror wasn't the ghosts themselves. It was imagining what their last days must have been like. Families who couldn't visit because TB was so contagious. People dying in isolation, calling out for loved ones who couldn't come. I eventually graduated and found a better job, but I still think about Mary sometimes. About how lonely she must be, sitting in that room night after night, waiting for someone else who needs comfort. The paranormal investigation company still runs tours there, and I've read online reviews from visitors who mention seeing a woman in white on the 4th floor. They always describe her the same way. Sad, but not frightening. Beautiful, but heartbreaking. I hope someday she finds peace, but part of me thinks she stays because that's who she was in life. Someone who comforted others, who couldn't stand to see people suffer alone. Even in death, she's still taking care of people. If you ever visit Waverly Hills and see her, don't be afraid. Just say hello. Tell her Marcus says hi and that he hopes she's doing okay. She might not answer, but I think she'll appreciate knowing that someone remembers her not as a ghost story, but as a person who was loved and who loved others enough to stay and help when they needed it most. Some hauntings aren't about terror. They're about love that's too strong to let go, even after death. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell someone about what happened to me at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. This was back in 2021, during the pandemic when I desperately needed work. The prison had been closed since 1971, but they kept a small night security team to protect the historic site from vandals and thieves. Eastern State was the world's first true penitentiary, built in 1829. The place was designed to break people through isolation. Prisoners spent 23 hours a day alone in tiny cells, with only 1 hour of exercise in a small yard. They wore hoods whenever they left their cells, so they couldn't see other inmates. The idea was that complete solitude would make them reflect on their crimes and become penitent. That's where the word penitentiary comes from. What they created instead was a factory for madness. Over 11,000 people died within those walls during its 142 years of operation. Suicide, murder, disease, despair so deep it literally killed people. By the time they shut it down, Eastern State had the reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. I didn't believe any of that when I started working there. I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in history that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. The job paid $15 an hour to walk around an empty prison for 8 hours. Easy money, or so I thought. My first night, the day supervisor Jim gave me the tour. Eastern State is massive, 30 acres of crumbling cell blocks spreading out like spokes from a central hub. The architecture is Gothic, all stone towers and barred windows that look like something from a medieval castle. During the day, it's a museum. At night, it becomes something else entirely. The main thing, Jim told me as we walked through cell block 12, is don't go into cell block 4 alone, and whatever you do, don't spend too much time in cell 145. Why not? I asked. Jim stopped walking. He was a big guy, probably 50 years old, looked like he'd seen everything. But when he talked about cell block 4, his voice got quiet. That's where they kept the worst ones, death row. And cell 145, that's where they found William Morrison in 1897. He'd been in solitary for 6 months. When they opened his cell, he was sitting in the corner, completely catatonic. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't even look at anyone. They transferred him to an asylum, but he died 3 days later. What's that got to do with anything? I asked. People who spend too much time in that cell start acting like Morrison. They get quiet, withdrawn, start talking to someone who isn't there. We've lost 2 guards that way. They quit without notice, said they couldn't handle the voices anymore. I laughed it off. Jim seemed like a practical guy, not the type to believe in ghost stories. But he wasn't laughing. I'm serious, Sarah. That place gets into your head. Just do your rounds quick and get out. The first week went fine. The prison was creepy, sure. Endless rows of empty cells, rusted bars, graffiti from decades of urban explorers who'd snuck in before they improved security. But it was just an old building. I'd walk my rounds every 2 hours, check that all the entrances were secure, and spend the rest of my time reading in the visitor's center. Then came the night I heard the screaming. It was about 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was doing my round through cell block 7 when I heard it. A man's voice, screaming at the top of his lungs. Not words, just pure anguish. The kind of scream that comes from somewhere so deep inside you that it tears your throat raw. The screaming was coming from cell block 4. I radioed the police immediately, told them we had an intruder, possibly someone hurt. They arrived within 10 minutes. 4 officers with flashlights and weapons drawn. We searched every inch of cell block 4, every cell, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence anyone had been there. Must have been cats, one of the officers said. Sometimes feral cats get into these old buildings and they can sound almost human when they fight. But I knew what I'd heard. That wasn't an animal. That was a human being in agony. After the police left, I called Jim, woke him up, but I didn't care. Told him what happened. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Did you go into 145? He asked. No. I stayed in the main corridor like you said. Good. Look, Sarah, I probably should have told you this before, but we get reports like this maybe once a month. Always the same thing. Screaming from cell block 4, always around 3 a.m. We've had the police out dozens of times. Never found anything. So what am I supposed to do? Just ignore it. I know that sounds crazy, but trust me, the screaming can't hurt you. It's when you start hearing other things that you need to worry. I almost quit that night. Would have, except I really needed the money. Rent in Philadelphia was brutal, and jobs were scarce because of COVID. So I stuck it out, but I started bringing headphones to work. When I had to walk past cell block 4, I'd blast music so loud I couldn't hear anything else. That worked for about 3 weeks. Then I started seeing the shadow. It was always in my peripheral vision. A dark figure standing at the end of the hallway, just out of range of my flashlight. When I turned to look directly at it, Nothing was there, but I could feel it watching me, following me through my rounds. The shadow never came close, never tried to interact with me. It just watched. But there was something about its presence that filled me with dread, like it was waiting for something. I mentioned it to Jim during a shift change, trying to sound casual about it. "Yeah, that's Morrison," he said matter-of-factly. "He shows up when someone new starts working nights. Usually takes a few weeks before people notice him." "Morrison? The guy from cell 145? That's the one. He's harmless, mostly, just curious about new people. But Sarah, if he ever approaches you directly, if he ever tries to communicate, you call me immediately and get out of the building. Don't wait. Don't finish your shift. Just leave." "Why? What happens if he tries to communicate?" Jim looked at me for a long moment. "The last guard who said Morrison talked to him quit the next day. Found him a week later in his apartment. He'd barricaded himself in his bedroom closet and wouldn't come out. Kept saying that Morrison told him secrets about the prison, about what really happened in those cells. Guy had to be hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. That should have been my cue to find another job. But honestly, by that point, I was getting used to Morrison. He never got closer than about 50 feet, never made any threatening moves. It was almost comforting in a weird way, knowing someone was keeping me company during those long, lonely nights. The real problem started when I began hearing the whispers. It happened gradually at first, just soft murmurs that I could almost convince myself were the wind or the building settling. But over the course of a few weeks, the whispers got clearer. Multiple voices, all talking at once, like a crowd of people having quiet conversations just out of earshot. The whispers followed me everywhere in the prison. They'd get louder when I passed certain cells, especially in cell block 4. And sometimes, if I listened really carefully, I could almost make out words. "Help me. So cold. Let me out. 23 years in this cell. I didn't do it. Make it stop. I started having trouble sleeping during the day." The voices would follow me home, whispering in my head even after I'd left the prison. I'd lie in bed, exhausted, but unable to shut off the constant murmur of desperate voices. That's when Morrison finally approached me. It was a Thursday night in December, about 2 months after I'd started working there. I was walking through cell block 12 when I saw him step out of the shadows at the far end of the hallway. Not just a glimpse this time. He was standing directly under one of the emergency lights, as real and solid as anyone. He was tall and thin, wearing the old black and white striped prison uniform. His hair was long and unkempt, his face gaunt from malnutrition. But his eyes were the worst part, completely empty, like looking into 2 black holes where a person's soul used to be. He raised one finger to his lips in a shush gesture, then beckoned for me to follow him. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run. Call Jim, call the police, get out of the building. But something about Morrison's gesture wasn't threatening. It was almost pleading, like he desperately needed to show me something. Against my better judgment, I followed him. He led me through a maze of corridors I'd never seen before, down a narrow staircase to a sub-basement level that wasn't on any of the prison maps. The whispers got louder as we descended, until they were almost shouting. But Morrison never looked back, just kept walking with that same purposeful stride. We ended up in a small windowless room that contained nothing but a single wooden chair and a table covered with papers. Morrison gestured toward the table, then stepped back into the shadows. The papers were records. Medical files, incident reports, letters from prisoners to their families that had never been sent, all dating from the 1880s and 1890s. As I read through them, a horrifying picture emerged. The isolation wasn't just punishment, it was an experiment. The prison administrators had been deliberately driving inmates insane to study the effects of solitary confinement. They documented everything. How long it took for prisoners to start talking to themselves. How many developed catatonia? How many committed suicide? Morrison's file was there too. William Morrison, age 26, imprisoned for theft. The notes described how they'd kept him in solitary for increasingly long periods, recording his psychological deterioration in clinical detail. The final entry, dated just days before his transfer to the asylum, was chilling. Subject exhibits complete dissociation from reality, speaks only to unseen entities, claims the walls are whispering to him, recommended for immediate transfer before condition becomes permanent. I looked up from the papers to find Morrison standing right in front of me. His mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, in a voice like rustling leaves, he spoke his first words in over a century. "They're still here," he whispered. "All of them, trapped in the walls, waiting for someone to tell their story." That's when I understood. The whispers weren't just echoes or imagination. They were the voices of everyone who died in Eastern State. All the prisoners who'd been driven mad by the isolation, all the victims of a system designed to break human minds. And Morrison had been trying to lead someone to their records for decades, hoping someone would finally expose what had really happened there. I gathered up all the papers and left the prison that night. Never went back. I quit by email the next morning and spent the next 6 months researching everything I'd found. Turned out, rumors about psychological experiments at Eastern State had been floating around academic circles for years, but no one had ever found proof. The documents Morrison showed me were eventually donated to the University of Pennsylvania archives, and they've become the basis for a major historical revision of Eastern State's legacy. The prison isn't just remembered as a place of punishment anymore, but as the site of systematic psychological torture. I still work in security, but never again at a place with that kind of history. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, but they're different now, quieter, more peaceful, like they're finally resting now that their story has been told. I think Morrison is at peace too. At least, I hope he is. He spent over a century trying to be heard, trying to expose the truth about what happened in that place. Maybe now that the story's out there, he can finally let go. Some ghosts aren't there to scare you. Some of them are there because they have something important to say, and they'll keep trying to say it until someone finally listens. My name is David, and I used to work the overnight shift at KQED Radio in San Francisco. This happened in 2022, when I was desperate for any job that would pay my student loans. The station had been broadcasting from the same tower on Twin Peaks since 1954, and they needed someone to monitor the equipment during the dead hours between midnight and 6 a.m. The job was simple: make sure the signal stayed strong, log any technical issues, and if the emergency broadcast system activated, follow the protocols. Most nights, I'd just sit in the booth reading or playing games on my phone while the automated programming ran. The tower itself was this massive steel structure, over 300 feet tall, with red warning lights that blinked all night long. It had been there so long that it had become part of the San Francisco skyline. But what most people didn't know was that the tower had a dark history. In 1973, a disc jockey named Michael Chen had jumped from the observation platform during his late-night show. He'd been struggling with depression, and one night he just walked out of the booth, climbed the emergency ladder, and leaped. His body was found the next morning by a maintenance worker. The strange thing was, his show had kept broadcasting for another 2 hours after he died. Just dead air, with the occasional sound of papers rustling or a chair creaking. The engineers could never explain how the microphone stayed open that long. My supervisor Dave told me this story on my first night, more as a safety warning than anything else. "Don't go up on the observation platform alone," he said. "Insurance liability. But also, some people say they still hear Michael up there sometimes, still trying to do his show." I laughed it off. Dave seemed like he was just trying to spook the new guy. But after he left, and I was alone in that booth, surrounded by all the old broadcasting equipment, the story didn't seem so funny anymore. The first few nights were quiet. I'd sit there watching the signal meters, listening to the automated overnight programming. Classic jazz mostly, with station IDs every hour. The booth was small and cramped, filled with decades-old equipment that hummed and clicked constantly, but it was peaceful in its own way. Then, on my fourth night, I heard the voice. It was around 2 a.m. I was half asleep in my chair when I heard someone talking through the studio speakers. Not the program broadcast, but a live voice. Male, middle-aged, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Good evening, night owls. You're listening to KQED, where the music never stops and the conversation never ends." I sat up immediately. The automation system didn't have any programming like that scheduled. I checked all the inputs, all the boards. Everything showed the regular jazz program should be playing. But this voice kept talking. "It's a beautiful night here in San Francisco. Clear skies, temperature dropping to about 55 degrees. Perfect weather for staying inside and listening to some good music." I called Dave immediately. Woke him up at home. Told him we had some kind of signal interference. Someone pirating our frequency. "That's impossible," Dave said. "We're on a closed system. Nobody can break into our signal without physical access to the transmitter." "Well, someone's doing it. There's a guy on the air right now talking about the weather." Long pause on Dave's end. "What's he sound like? Asian guy, maybe 40 years old, kind of formal way of talking." My blood went cold. "Yeah, how did you know that?" "I'll be right there." Dave arrived 20 minutes later, and by then the voice had stopped. The regular programming was back to normal, like nothing had happened. But Dave looked shaken. "That was Michael Chen," he said quietly. "I worked with him back in the 70s. I'd recognize his voice anywhere." "Come on, Dave. Dead people don't host radio shows." "No, they don't. But Michael loved this place more than anything. He used to say radio was the only thing that made sense to him, the only place he felt like himself. Maybe he's still trying to broadcast." I wanted to quit right then, but Dave convinced me to stay, said Michael had never hurt anyone, that he was probably just lonely, and honestly, I needed the money too much to walk away. The next week, Michael's voice came through 3 more times, always between 2 and 4 a.m., always the same gentle patter about the weather and the music. He never acknowledged that anyone was listening, never responded when I tried to talk back through the microphone. He just did his show, like he had for all those years before he died. I started looking forward to it in a weird way. Michael had a soothing voice, and he clearly knew his stuff about music. He'd introduce songs with little stories about the artists, share bits of jazz history, talk about concerts he'd seen in San Francisco back in the day. It was like having a conversation with someone who really understood the magic of late-night radio. But then, things started getting strange. It began with the request line. The phone would ring during Michael's broadcasts, even though we didn't take calls during the overnight shift. When I'd answer, there would be silence, then the sound of someone crying softly. Always a different voice, but always the same quiet, sobbing. Then, I started noticing that Michael's show was getting longer each night. First, just an extra 15 minutes, then half an hour. Eventually, he was broadcasting for nearly 2 hours, completely taking over our regular programming. The worst part was that I could never record any of it. Every time I tried to capture Michael's voice on tape or digital, all I got was static, but I could hear him clear as day through the studio monitors. One night in November, Michael's show was different. Instead of his usual cheerful patter, he sounded sad, desperate. "I've been trying to reach someone," he said. "Anyone, for so long now, but nobody seems to hear me anymore. The calls used to come in, people would request songs, share their stories, but now it's just silence." That's when I realized what was happening. Michael wasn't just broadcasting to the living. He was the host for everyone who had died lonely in San Francisco, all the people who used to call late-night radio shows because they had nobody else to talk to. The crying voices on the request line weren't prank calls. They were ghosts, trying to connect with someone, anyone, the way they had when they were alive. "Michael," I said into my microphone, even though I'd never been able to reach him before. "Michael, I can hear you. You're not alone." The studio went completely silent. Then Michael's voice came through, different than before, closer, like he was sitting right next to me. "You can hear me? Really hear me?" "I can hear you. I've been listening every night for weeks." "Oh, thank God. I thought I was broadcasting into nothing. It's been so quiet, so empty. I just wanted to keep doing what I loved. But without listeners, what's the point of radio?" We talked for the rest of the night. Michael told me about his life, his struggles with depression, how the radio booth was the only place he'd ever felt truly at peace. He said he'd been trying to continue his show after death, but he couldn't tell if anyone was listening anymore. "The others can hear me," he said. "The lonely ones, the ones who died alone. They call in sometimes, but they can't really talk. They just cry. I try to play music that comforts them, but I don't know if it helps." "It helps," I told him. "Just knowing someone's there, someone who understands, that helps more than you know." From that night forward, Michael and I became partners. He'd do his show, and I'd take the calls from his ghostly listeners. I couldn't understand most of what they said, but I could offer a kind word, let them know someone was listening. Michael would play their requests when he could figure out what they wanted. Word somehow got out among San Francisco's lonely dead. The calls started coming in earlier each night, more and more voices reaching out from whatever place they were trapped in. Michael's show became a lifeline for spirits who had died, isolated, and forgotten. I worked at KQED for another 8 months after that. During the day, we broadcast normal programming to the living, but at night, Michael and I ran San Francisco's only radio show for the dead. The station management never knew, because the ghost broadcast somehow didn't interfere with our regular signal. Only I could hear them. Eventually, I got a better job offer and had to leave. But on my last night, Michael had a special request. "I need you to find someone else," he said. "Someone who can hear us, who understands how important this is. These people, they died alone, but they don't have to stay alone forever." I did find someone. A young woman named Lisa, who was studying communications and needed night work. I trained her for a week, told her the whole story. She thought I was crazy, until the first time Michael's voice came through the speakers. That was 3 years ago. I still drive up to Twin Peaks sometimes, late at night, and tune my car radio to KQED. Michael's still there, still taking calls from the lonely dead, still playing music for people who have nobody else. Some hauntings aren't about fear or revenge. Sometimes they're just about connection, about not wanting to be forgotten or alone. And sometimes the living can help bridge that gap, can offer comfort to souls who are still searching for a voice in the darkness. Radio waves travel forever, they say. Maybe that's why Michael chose to stay. In a world of infinite frequencies, there's always room for one more voice, one more story, one more chance to reach out and touch someone else's life. Even after death, the show must go on.